A very warm welcome to everybody for joining us today. My name is Monica Taylor and I'm one of the directors of Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia. We begin by acknowledging that we're all meeting virtually on land that was stolen. Traditional owners of these lands never ceded their sovereignty. And we want to pay our deepest respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander laws, customs and practices have protected country for millennia. For First Nations peoples, the climate crisis is yet another chapter in the 235-year history of colonisation, and we recognise that there can be no climate justice without First Nations justice. Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia is really thrilled to be hosting today's event. We are really fortunate to have Senator David Pocock in the room alongside Anjali Sharma to speak about the Climate Change Amendment, Duty of Care and Intergenerational Climate Equity Bill, which from this point forward will shorthand to the bill or the Duty of Care Bill. And many of you know that the bill comes off the back of the brave, innovative litigation run by Equity Generation lawyers with Anjali as the lead litigant and 7 other young people, which successfully argued at first instance that the Minister for the Environment had a common law duty of care towards children and young people with respect to climate change impacts. Despite that decision being later overturned on appeal, it hasn't stopped Anjali from pursuing her cause and finding allies in the form of Senator Pocock, who shares her passion for climate and intergenerational justice. So I'm going to first invite Senator Pocock to explain the bill and his work in tabling it in the Senate. And then we'll put some audience questions to David. So please use the chat function if you're able to do that. Time is limited, but we will do what we can. Senator Pocock may need to leave for parliamentary commitments, but after questions, we will invite Anjali to share her story and explain the broader campaign and what we can all do to support it and get involved. I'm dispensing with long speaker introductions because I think we all agree that time's better spent hearing directly from these 2 incredible advocates instead of me just rattling off some extensive and impressive bios. So Senator Pocock, over to you.
Thanks, Monica. And thank you all so much for your time and all the work you all do in various areas on this issue. This for me started long before I was formally in politics as a senator. I remember watching Anjali Sharma and the other young people taking the former Environment Minister to court and sort of following along. And when they won, thinking, well, of course, we have a duty of care to young people. This is common sense. Finally, common sense has won out in sort of climate politics in Australia. And then obviously there was the appeal, and I remember just being so furious that we had a government that could argue that they didn't in fact have a duty of care, rather than just accepting, okay, we had a duty of care, arguing and then obviously winning. And Ange moved to Canberra to study for uni, and got in touch and sort of said, I'm keen to keep progressing this. And we started looking at, well, where could this duty sit? The Chief Justice said that ultimately this should be up to the Parliament, not the judiciary. And I know there's mixed opinions on that, but if it is up to the Parliament, well, then let's get on with it. Let's do it. And so the duty of care bill, as it's drafted, would insert a duty of care into a range of existing legislation that govern the way that the Environment Minister, other decision makers and delegated decision makers make decisions when it comes to projects that will have significant emissions. And it inserts 2 things. The first one is that they must consider the impact on young people and future generations. which is a good starting point. But you could argue that that's just a box ticking exercise, and we know that they do that for a range of things, and then say, okay, well, but we need this project. So the second part of the bill says that they cannot proceed with a project if there will be a material impact on the lives of young people and future generations. And so it's really simple. I think we probably need this across the board. I've been shocked at the short-term decision-making in Parliament, in government. They're not incentivized to think beyond the next election, because the news cycle is so short. People's attention spans, it's the here and now. I would love to see more long-term thinking on all sorts of things, from health to transport to all the rest. But this is firmly aimed at climate and decisions that we make there. So it's a simple bill. It was referred to a Senate committee. It's open for submissions till November the 23rd. And then next year, we will look to have a day of hearings to hear from legal experts, to hear from young people, to hear from a range of people on this bill. And the committee will ultimately then recommend to the Parliament what to do with this bill. The legislation committees that bills get referred to are majority government senators, and so when it's a government bill, the recommendation is pass the bill, and when it's not, it's usually don't pass the bill. So there's a lot of work to be done there in the advocacy space, really pushing this and creating a bit of a groundswell behind the idea that a duty of care is owed. My view is that this is totally inevitable. This will absolutely happen at some point. The opportunity for us is to bring that point forward, and I think that's it's a challenge, but it's certainly not impossible when it comes to climate politics. And I think parties like Labor are feeling more and more heat when it comes to actually delivering on their sort of commitments and rhetoric. So that's it in a nutshell. It might be better for me to stop talking and I can answer some questions.
Thank you, Senator. And also, just to clarify, I'm not quite sure whether we have you for the full hour or whether you need to be running away because of parliamentary commitments and obligations.
I'm not sure either. Let me check.
All right. Well, we can keep asking you questions until
I'm definitely here for now.
Look, one question that we did think of beforehand that we wanted to ask you was how you think other senators are responding to the bill. Can you give us a sense of, I guess, the vibe amongst your colleagues about how it's being received?
We deliberately pushed it straight to a committee to give us more time to build the case and to have some of those softer conversations and not force the parties to come to a position quickly. I think that was the right approach. And an amazing group of young women have been leading, I guess, a lot of work behind the scenes. Last week, I think it was, or the week before, they had 35 meetings. Ange can talk more about that, but it's a hard thing to argue against. And I think that's one of the powerful things about this is most people can identify with a duty of care. They exist all over the place. And so to argue that politicians, decision makers somehow don't have a duty of care to young people, I think is very hard to do. But when we saw the previous government do that. Labor certainly haven't come to a position yet. Very strong support from a number of crossbenchers who are offering to really help push this.
There's a question in the chat from Avi, who is asking, under which head of power would this legislation be enacted? And considering the capacity of the fossil fuel industry, which would surely challenge it, would a High Court would have? What do you think the High Court would do in terms of validating this law? So it's quite a legal question.
I'd probably leave that to the legal experts, but it's not. It's simply inserting additional requirements on decision makers into a whole range of existing acts. So from the Climate Change Act to the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund sort of governing act, wherever these decisions get made, they sort of get made across a broad range of areas and portfolios. It's simply saying that decision maker, before they can approve funding or a project to proceed, they have to consider this duty of care. So I'm not sure what that would mean legally and how it would potentially be challenged, but that's certainly something that we're keen to dig into in the committee process and through submissions. You hear so much from the major parties and particularly from the coalition about concerns about lawfare and how there's just going to be litigation all over the place from young people on climate and what a disaster it's going to be for projects. And so we've really tried to keep this simple and hopefully legally sound, but I guess that's the whole point of this committee process.
Yeah, and there are people asking in the chat about whether there are other examples internationally of legislated duties of care. Do you want to speak a little bit to that?
To varying degrees. There's well over 100 countries who have legislated some sort of either right to a healthy environment or some sort of obligation to young people and future generations. A lot of them are countries where international treaties essentially get translated into local law. I guess you can then have the argument about whether or not that's actually being effective. But we're certainly seeing the recent court case in Montana in the US, where young people are demanding this, are saying you should absolutely be making decisions that leave us with some sort of livable future, leave us with a healthy environment. And ACF have done some polling of young people and incredibly strong. The vast majority of young people want this. They want decision makers to be making decisions that mean that they have a good future.
100%. And the people in this room today are also 100% behind you on that, Senator Pocock. We really want to reiterate our kind of thanks to you for taking the lead in tabling this private members bill and doing something innovative to insert those legal protections. There's some conversation in the chat about statutory duty of care versus a human right to a healthy environment. And we know that the ACT is taking steps to insert a right to a clean and healthy environment in its human rights legislation. So do you think that the duty of care is a step towards potentially a right to a healthy environment nationally?
Well, it's a glaring gap in Australia not having some sort of overarching Human Rights Act or Bill of Rights or some sort of framework. And it seems to, last week with these sort of security laws that were rushed through, there's just nothing to keep that sort of thing in check. And I'd argue that if we were going to look at a Human Rights Act, then the right to a healthy environment would be pretty fundamental. And it's certainly something we've been having conversations with a whole range of stakeholders who've been pushing for a Human Rights Act in Australia for a long time and are thinking about. And again, it's probably something that's inevitable, but just taking far too long. And so I think this duty of care hopefully can be some sort of precursor.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, probably the last question for you, Senator, is what can our movement do to exert pressure? We know that the submissions on the bill close on Thursday, and there's also a petition that is running and getting a lot of traction. In addition to that, though, do you have suggestions for how we can really lean in to support the bill?
I mean, at this stage, there's 2 more days for submissions. So if anyone's keen to throw a submission into the committee, that would be great. And then I'm sure Ange will touch on it, but really trying to build a campaign into next year to highlight. There's so much doom and gloom, and it's warranted. If you read the news and see where we're at and where we're heading, but I mean, my message is it doesn't have to be that way. We've been gifted the knowledge that we do have this small window to act, and we're going to need everything. And for me, the duty of care is one of the ways of ensuring that we don't proceed with projects that are simply going to make things worse. And so I guess in terms of this bill, getting involved, the petition, sharing it, all those sorts of things. But next year, when we hopefully start to mobilize more people, looking out for that. But then also just the narrative in Australia, where I think we've now sort of cottoned on to the fact that we need to transition, and we're hearing the government talk a lot about that, but they're also wanting to expand the fossil fuel industry. And so really trying to chip away at that and saying, well, we need to transition, but we can't continue to expand the fossil fuel industry at the same time. That's not a transition. That's more of the same.
And contrary to what the scientists are telling us loud and clear.
Precisely.
Thank you so much. I think due to time, we might throw across to Anjali now to speak about the broader campaign that she has been leading. And I believe you've got some slides there, Anj.
Yeah, thank you. I did have slides, but I am feeling like going off script today and not giving the full kind of spiel, but just talking. I feel like this is a more like receptive group. So instead of giving the whole purpose and function behind the bill, I might just talk to the campaign and how it came about. So my name is Anjali. I am a first year law student at ANU, and I come from India. I was born in India, and much of my extended family still live in India, which is very relevant to this campaign and to my broader kind of interest in climate change, because the reason that I'm so passionate about it is having seen my extended family go through severe periods of heat waves and floods to an extent that we haven't quite seen yet here in Australia, and also not having the resources and the money that is needed to both rebuild after disaster and then to safeguard themselves before the next one. So I think specifically of especially recent years, last year was a horrific year for India in terms of heat waves. There are recounts on social media, in traditional media, of people in the central part of India, especially watching asphalt outside their houses melt, watching birds fall out of the sky, watching rubbish tips end up on fire. It was really hard for the agricultural economy as well, and for a lot of the informal market, because a lot of people in India make their money out of selling things on street markets or driving rickshaws, which are forms of private transport where through bicycles. And the extreme heat made it quite hard for people to earn that money that they would otherwise. Floods this year in India, you may have seen images, washed away entire towns, and took lives and livelihoods. And so seeing this from the other side of the world for much of my life has made me realize kind of, firstly, how relatively safe Australia is compared to countries that are equatorial and countries that are in the global south, but also how much more privilege I have here in Australia to be able to draw attention to this and use whatever platform I have in a country that allows for free speech a lot more than India does, to advocate for greater climate action, which is, I guess, the beginning of my story. I only ever drew the link between climate disaster and climate change around the age of 12, 13, when I was making that transition to high school, watching National Geographic and Al Jazeera and BBC YouTube videos and taking notes in my notes app about the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming. But I'm here now. I'm well and truly radicalized, and yeah, that's kind of my origin story, if that makes sense. It's kind of been a key theme for me from the get-go that marginalized groups are the ones that stand to lose the most right now, stand to be hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change. And so that is, you know, people of color, given that a lot of countries in the global south and on the equator have people of color, those who live in poverty, which, as we know, is overwhelmingly women, but also young people, because young people stand to bear the brunt of policy decisions that are made today. And as David pointed out, despite this, policy decisions made today are often made with short-termism in mind, with the 3-year election cycle in mind, with politicians wondering how they can secure their seats at the next ballot, and you know, ascend to ministerial positions and all of these political ideas. Climate change often becomes an exercise of politicking, and with that, the lives of young people become an exercise in politicking. And, you know, we've seen a movement over the last few years where young people refuse to stand for this any longer. The school strikes, especially of 2019, come to mind, where 200,000 people marched through the streets of Melbourne calling on their government to increase their climate ambition. But for this campaign specifically, just the crux of it is that duties of care are owed generally in society. We know a road user owes a duty of care to another road user, a teacher to its student, a doctor to their patient. And yet there is no policy mechanism currently that compels our elected officials to exercise their power in a way that ensures that when they hand over their seats to my generation and to the generations after me, our futures are livable, are safe in the context of climate change. There is no policy mechanism that ensures that when they exercise their power to approve fossil fuel projects, that they do so with our health and well-being in mind, even though we know that climate change poses a severe health risk, and particularly to my generation and to the generations to come. This is a very severe policy gap, we believe, and it's one that we're aiming to plug. And there are similar things that exist like this around the world. Wales, in fact, I'm sure many of you might be aware, has implemented a Future Generations Act and a Future Generations Commissioner. So the role of the commissioner is to scrutinise the impact of any policy decision made by Wales on current and future generations. And so obviously the remit of that is much broader than the duty of care bill, but what we're aiming to do is something very, very similar, just in the context of climate change. Netherlands and other countries have had similar court cases about a duty of care. As David mentioned, we just saw Montana and held achieve success, obviously in a very different environment given Montana's constitutional right to a healthy environment. But also on that, as David said, 161 countries have validated the right for young people to have a healthy environment. And this has also been passed as a resolution through the UN General Assembly. So we know that we're not proposing something completely radical, and that many countries around the world have implemented similar legislation. And as David said, this is a matter of inevitability now. Young people aren't taking government inaction lying down anymore, and that's why we're not just on the streets anymore. There's young people in the courts, there's young people in parliament, not just, you know, going for positions, but lobbying and all of that. So I guess I'll talk a little bit more specifically to our campaign and our campaign strategies. Firstly, we have that petition that I put in the chat, and we were very, very excited to reach 10,000 signatures just last week. And we're hoping for that to grow exponentially. We have been seeing especially exponential growth over the last few weeks as politicians become more aware of our bill, and it becomes more mainstream, given the week of success that we've just had in Parliament, which I'll touch on in a bit. We also have the submissions process currently before the Senate inquiry. And we know that the Senate will be holding oral hearings in mid-February and then delivering its report to the Parliament as to the bill at the start of March. We are also working with unions, with advocacy groups, with businesses to kind of make this bill less of a advocacy mechanism and or a radical mechanism and more of a mainstream idea. We don't want this, and we've stressed this repeatedly, we don't want this to be something that we chuck at the Labor government, they hid it away, and we never hear about it ever again. We want this to be something that achieves a broad-based coalition of support, from health professionals, from unions, from peak bodies, from students, from academics, from every sector of society, because, as I said, a duty of care is a very general concept. And we don't want this to be something that backs Labor into a corner, takes the decisions out of their hands to the point where they get scared and vote it down, and that's the end of that. Which is why we're trying to bring so many people on side. We've had amazing success with unions such as the NDEU, with the New South Wales Teachers Federation. They've been lovely. With businesses, they've all been amazing. We've been really happy with the reception. As David mentioned earlier, we just finished a lobbying week in Parliament. And so that was 26 young people from every corner of Australia coming to Canberra for a day. We met with 41 MPs in a day. I'm still recovering. And we took every single one a pledge that said, I support a duty of care. And we met with these politicians, we ran them through the bill, the campaign, how it came about, and the general principle of a duty of care, and we asked them to sign the pledge. So out of our 41 meetings, some of whom were with senior ministers, we were very lucky to get Mark Butler, the Minister for Health. We were very lucky to get Chris Bowen's Chief of Staff. Out of all these 41 meetings, we ended up getting 24 pledges signed. 7 of them were actually from the Labor Party, which is massive, and 1 was an assistant minister within the Labor Party, which is absolutely incredible. And we are really looking to continue those relationships and to bring the government on side, because, as I said, we don't want this to be something that backs them into a corner. We want to bring them on board and to work with them in passing this bill, whether that be through amendments, negotiations, whatever they see fit. We're also working towards, in March, a decentralised week of action, because that is when the Senate committee will be handing down their report. So we're currently working with a few crossbench MPs for them to organise events within their electorates, bringing young people to these events to be able to speak on the need for this duty of care and to be able to raise the public profile of the bill and to use that to leverage that as support for the bill, because we all know that, we elect the government. If the government sees enough support for this bill, that's a very, very key way to get it passed. We have drawn together a very successful alliance for a duty of care, and that goes back to all of these unions, advocacy groups, businesses, climate action networks that have supported our bill, have been invited to this alliance, which is a fortnightly meeting where people share their ideas about how a duty of care can be passed, what support can be leveraged, what events can be construed, what tactics can be used. And I know there's many people on this call who may have been to one of those meetings, and so thank you so much for your support. It's an amazing group that has helped us with a lot of things, including the lobbying week. We couldn't have financed that or arranged it without the support of the alliance, and the pledge was actually an idea born out of the alliance, so we're very, very grateful for that. And we've been very happy with the reception from the Labor Party. As I said, we have had some very common responses. Number one being that Labor is doing enough on climate change. Our response to that has been, we know you have targets. We know that, while there is debate about that, they are ambitious targets compared especially to the previous government. We want this duty of care to be a tool in Labor's belt to achieve those targets, and we also know that there's no policy mechanism that specifically addresses the rights of young people, and that is key for a future with intergenerational equity. We've been told that this bill could open the floodgates litigation. That's been a very common response, as David touched on earlier. Our response to that is that this bill is narrowly defined. We know that it will only apply to fossil fuel projects that over their lifetime are predicted to emit over 100,000 tonnes of carbon emissions. We also know that the concept of a duty of care will continue to be pressed in the courts regardless. There was the case of Sharma, Environment Minister. There is now the case of Pabai and the Australian government, which is also arguing for a duty of care to Torres Strait Islanders in the context of climate change. And we know that the duty of care concept won't stop being pushed through the courts. So it's either that a duty of care to young people is defined now through legislation, or that it continues to be something that the federal court and the High Court are pressed on. We've also been told that private members' bills never pass. And also that's true. Costs do keep most litigants out of court. We were very, very lucky with our ability to be able to take the government to court, but it is a very inaccessible mechanism, especially for young people, given that this bill targets young people and they're the ones who will have standing to define it in the courts. It's quite an inaccessible route. We've been told that private members' bills never pass, but we do know that when they do pass, they're often on morally evocative issues, tobacco, seatbelts, same-sex marriage, that have actually been they've had quite wide-ranging impacts on Australian society. And we want this one to pass because we want the government to be on side. We want to engage in government processes and consultation, and the duty of care, again, is not a radical concept. We firmly believe that, and the previous government fought tooth and nail to argue that the duty of care doesn't exist. We would hope that this one would be different. And as I said, that being said, we have had early indication of support from key Labor members, from key groups, and we're really, really excited to build on that. This group as well has been absolutely instrumental to the Alliance. I see lots of familiar faces, and to pushing the campaign. I've dropped a link to the petition in the chat. It'd be amazing if you could sign, you could share that. I'm sure many people here are working on submissions as well for the Senate inquiry. And yeah, we look forward to continuing these relationships and working with you further. I think that's all from me. So I'll hand back to Monica, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Anjali. You've just painted a really good kind of picture for us of not just this law reform in and of itself, but the broader campaign that is going to have a longer lifespan than just Thursday. People will be working, lobbying, making noise right through until March and beyond. And I guess that's a message for our audience to not just sort of sign and forget, but potentially to think about going and talking to your local MP. It sounds as though that there is some potential ground that can move there if we make a lot of noise to sitting Labor MPs. It was very heartening to hear that you got a good reception when you went to Canberra. And so heartening as well to hear that the union movement, the medical fraternity, obviously the legal profession has a real role to play here as well. Anjali, we wanted to ask you a question about this, unique situation you find yourself in, having been a lead litigant in such high-profile court action when you were only 16, and now you find yourself as a law student learning the very sort of areas of law that you took to its highest levels. There are a lot of law students and lawyers on the call. You've probably touched the pointy end of law and litigation more than most. So how would you respond, I suppose, to the suggestion that law is just inherently conservative and difficult to shift?
I think we saw that it is difficult to shift given that the federal court ruled against us on a few what I see as very legalistic points, and it was very disappointing as I was 17, as a 17-year-old, being told that the moral arguments that you felt so connected to lost because of a few legal points, being, you know, indeterminate class of plaintiffs, being the judicial conservatism argument that courts shouldn't intervene in policy making. Yeah, it was quite hard to comprehend the idea that these arguments would take precedence over the argument for intergenerational equity, the argument for the rights of young people, especially as like a young naive law student who has only, you know, done torts and contracts as my only subjects so far. I do know that the law can shift, because we also saw this at the federal court with, you know, Justice Bromberg ruling in favor of us. Honestly, now I look in retrospect and I think that none of us expected that. I personally barely expected to get past the first interlocutory hearing, but we did. The court found that there was a case to be heard. The case was heard, and the first judge ruled in favor of us. And I think that the role of the law is to shift with public opinion, and that was definitely a ruling that accorded with public opinion. I think it was received incredibly well, in a way that the Federal Court of Appeal ruling was not. And so I would hope that while it is quite slow moving, these incremental changes, as general public opinion shifts, drags the law. It may be kicking and screaming, but, you know, drags the law along with it. We've seen it happen, and we know that there are more opportunities for it to happen. The case of Uncle Paul Knuckle Pie has just finished its hearings in Melbourne, I believe, and we'll be awaiting judicial determination very soon. And I would hope that's a duty of care case that does succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Karen Dyberg has raised her hand, so I'm going to invite her to put a question to you.
Thanks, Anjali. I think you're doing well just to know what interlocutory hearings are in your first year of law school. Is it kind of likely to divide on party lines, or is it something that we're still hoping that coalition MPs might be willing to support on the basis that it's not a radical idea?
So the way that I see it is I'm quite sure that the coalition as a party will come to a position that they won't support the bill, just given the diverse range of ideas and perspectives on climate change within the party. But that being said, our week of action included, I think, 6 coalition MPs that we met with. And 2 of those meetings were incredibly positive. One was, of course, the beautiful Bridget Archer, who signed our pledge as well. And the other, interestingly, was Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Ted O'Brien. We met with his office and we had a lovely chat with them about their concerns for the bill, which were, of course, the role of minerals and fossil fuels in the upcoming the years of the energy industry, which we know is a position widely shared among coalition MPs, and the floodgates litigation argument, which we had a very productive chat with them about, and they do want to stay engaged and up to date as the Senate committee process continues. That being said, we had some coalition MPs who were incredibly condescending, incredibly patronizing. We had a few 12-year-olds too who came to lobby with us, and they were very, very smart, but unfortunately there were some coalition MPs who took it upon themselves to be extra condescending because of their age. So again, very, very diverse responses. I do believe that the party as a whole will not support it, and therefore it will be split along party lines. But I think the diverse range of responses kind of shows that the 2-party system is not as strong and as cohesive as it used to be, and maybe that's an indication for future change within the parliament that could allow for more bills like this one, more morally evocative issues to be addressed in parliament.
Thanks, Anjali. I've just posted in the chat there to invite people to raise their hands if they want to ask questions directly. I think this is a really lovely informal conversation that we're having. And to the point about whether or not it's going to sort of succeed, what this is essentially doing is really doing an incredible awareness raising piece. Senator Pocock, I remember recalling you talk recently about your love for nature, and you made a point that we can't love what we don't know, and we can't fight for what we don't love. So that just reminds, I think, us all to really think about care for the environment, but also, our children and future generations. Do you want to sort of reflect, you're taking yourself off mute there, reflect on that comment and how this law reform ties into those, more philosophical notions of what we love and care about?
Sure. I think we know that most Australians love this incredible continent, and you ask anyone about their sort of special place or their fondest memories, and they'll often tell you about a beach or a camping trip to some gorge or river, and yet we're not looking after it. And so there's this disconnect. And that talk I gave was really about how do we develop a land ethic, a sort of connection to the places that we live in Australia that actually translates into our politics, where as one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we're willing to spend enough to look after these landscapes, these species that you don't get anywhere else in the world, that truly make Australia what it is. And I think that's shifting, but clearly we're up against the clock on this. We're up against climate change. And so my hope is, this duty of care bill and campaign, even if we can't get the votes, it's about making the case, because we know mid next year we're going to be debating an update to our environmental laws. And at the moment, it's really uncertain whether the government is going to entertain adding a climate trigger into those laws, which it absolutely has to have. And so I think this duty of care can be viewed on the path to that sort of climate trigger and actually taking climate change seriously, and the threat that it is. Not, I think for many years we talked about climate change as this kind of big thing that we all know we should be concerned about, but is quite out there. And we've now realized that, hang on, this is actually here, and it's not this big thing out there. This is actually about all the people and places we love. And so my hope is that we can keep tying the duty of care back to that. What is the moral response, the moral obligation on this? How does this affect a duty of care, but also how does this affect environmental laws and updating them?
Thank you. Yes, it seems like a really sensible idea for the minister to integrate this reform as part of the broader package of positive, nature positive law reform that Labor's talking about. I'm going to throw to, I think I did see a hand up. I think it was Chris McGrath. And yeah, thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, David and Ange, for such brilliant advocacy. And the bill is so ambitious and inspiring. There was a question earlier about the constitutional basis. It's very clearly justified under the external affairs power and Australia's obligations under the UNFCCC. The issue, and I'll make a submission on it, but one of the massive issues we faced in judicial review challenges to things like the Adani coal mine is the false reasoning around the drug dealers' defence, and the idea that if we don't approve this massive coal mine here, that someone somewhere else will approve the same coal being extracted. And I'll make a submission on it, but I think Section 15E needs to be tightened up on that, with the duty not to make significant decisions, because I can see the minister's reasoning already, which the minister exercised in waving through the minds, even in Ange's case, that, if we don't make this decision, then someone somewhere else will approve a similar amount of emissions, therefore there is no impact. And that's how you deal with the duty of care from the minister's perspective at the moment. If we don't do it, someone else will, therefore there is no impact. If we approve it, therefore we've dealt with the duty of care. So it's just such false reasoning, but it's been happening for 20 years. And this is a bold step forward to respond to that. That was a comment. I don't want to put David or Ange on the spot to respond to that. I'm sure you're getting submissions on those sorts of issues. But yeah, I've been involved in a lot of judicial review where trying to banging our heads against the drug dealers' defence. And I know Emma's Neckville had a really good crack at it just recently, but yeah, we continue to run that same argument over and over again, and the coal sector uses it. Everyone uses it. The environment minister uses it to justify the indefensible, because no one wants to take responsibility for the harm we're causing. So back to you, Mon.
Well, I was going to handball it back to the audience to see if anybody had any comments or questions that they would like to ask, because we're sort of getting to the top of the hour shortly, and we have this wonderful opportunity with a federal senator and our fantastic, indomitable lead litigant, Anjali Sharma, in the room.
Just while that happens, I'll just respond to that really quickly. I just want to say, yeah, I really appreciate that that comment from you, Chris. I obviously spent, after the court case happened, I spent quite a while reaching out to policy experts, environmental lawyers, as a Year 12 student, asking how this duty of care bill could be defined, which act it could go under, what its scope could be, what its function could be. But I'm not at all an expert in any of this. And while it was handballed over to the parliamentary drafters, I think that submissions that look at the specific language of the bill will really, really be appreciated. We've gotten submissions about narrowing the definition of health and well-being. We've gotten submissions about other parts of the act that need to be tightened up. And so, yeah, we appreciate every single one of those. And I hope that also, defining all of these things that might be otherwise grey areas in the bill, will be a tool in our belt to getting Parliament on side.
Yeah, and those of you who are legally trained and can make those sort of finer arguments, please do not miss the opportunity to make a submission, because to be able to square away those some of the mythologies around the lawfare and such things, it's really important that the Senate is educated in that way. A hand is raised with Karen.
Hello. I have a question, I guess, relating back to our organisation that I hoped and the Senator might both respond to is, from your positions in this fight, what do you see lawyers and Lawyers for Climate Justice could be doing to contribute? So from activists and young people and from politicians. We were really inspired by Doctors for the Environment, who have a really clear message about the health harms of climate change. Yeah, what should we be doing to kind of pull our weight in the campaign generally? And should I go first?
Yeah, sure. I think that, so one thing definitely is those submissions, because submissions will be rolling in from young people. We have grade 3 students drawing pictures and writing letters to the Senate committee, but there is this massive need for the Senate to hear what parts of the bill can be tightened up so that they aren't falling victim to the argument of floodgates litigation that will definitely be put to them. So that's one thing that definitely needs to be done. I guess the other thing is just being public about it. We really, really do want public statements of support, if possible, for the bill, to show again that it is accepted by a broad cross-section of society. So, while that whether that could be sharing the petition, sharing our social squares, which we do have prepared. My email once again is in the chat if anybody wants to reach out for those assets. We also will later on be visiting the idea of an open letter to the government, and we'll reach out through Alliance and through already established channels for people to put their names onto that. I think it just helping us mainstream the idea of this bill and not letting it be pigeonholed as one of those activist mechanisms. We'll have more actionable items for you in the future, but I guess for now it's just sign the petition, share the petition, make a submission, talk about it. And yeah, once again, those how-to resources for meeting your MP will be coming out, so I'll share those too. But in your capacity as lawyers, just help us make it a mainstream idea.
Thank you.
I mean, I don't have too much to add, but I'd just say thank you all for what you're doing. If you're on this call, you care, and you're probably thinking far too much about this and probably doing a lot, and we need it all. No single idea or thing is gonna solve this. It's gonna take everyone doing exactly what you're doing, continuing to push in your everyday work. So it's just a big thank you from me. I think it's been heartening to see that there has been, despite all the cases that don't get up. Look what's happening in the Tiwi Islands at the moment. There's some real sort of hopeful signs that communities and Australians are actually being able to have a bit more to say when it comes to these sorts of projects and the impact on them culturally, environmentally, or even sort of spiritually, as we've seen being argued in the Torres Strait and the Tiwis.
Sorry, can I also just really quickly add to that we did just discuss the idea of the law being inherently conservative. And I think that we can even play on that as a strength for people who may otherwise be opposed to radical change. And, like we have to take it incrementally. Maybe we can harness that in some sort of way, that if lawyers are behind this and the law being an inherently very scrutinizing profession, one that likes to look at the finer details, as is the general perception, that if lawyers for climate action and other similar bodies are on board, maybe that shows that this bill won't make the sky fall down.
Yeah,
Like the trust us that much.
That's really terrific. And just to, echo the thanks from you, Senator Pocock, right back at you, really. We are also very emboldened by the work that your office is doing, and Anjali. And because we are sort of almost at time, I'm going to invite Chris to sort of give you a proper thanks and send off for this afternoon.
Thanks, Mon. And I want to thank Senator Pocock and Ange for such inspiring presentations, and also the work that you do is so inspiring in the sort of dark days that we face. It's been over 20 years since we started to have the first mass coral bleachings on the coral reef on the GBR. In 2002, when the second mass coral bleaching event occurred, it was obvious that we were in hugely dire straits in Australia, and yet we were in the Howard years, and they were really dark days when no action was being taken. The urgency was here, but Howard just continued to push it off, and then Al Gore came around 2005, I think was his movie, and it was just so inspiring in those dark days. We roll forward 20 years and we haven't really moved very far in Australia policy wise. We're still approving every coal gas project that a proponent wants to put forward, so it's still, the policies haven't changed in 20 years materially. So to have you both, pushing a ambitious bill, and I disagree that it wouldn't make the sky fall in. I actually think it would make a radical change to Commonwealth decision making, but in a really positive way. It's like if someone was dying and you gave them, CPR, that would be a radical intervention to help their health, but this is like a CPR bill for our environment. And so thank you for your ambition and for your inspiration. And back to you, Monica.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, no, we echo that. If you're able to show your appreciation with a kind of little virtual round of applause, that would be lovely. Chris, you're always so great with a metaphor. I think the CPR metaphor is a lovely one to close on. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. In terms of Lawyers for Climate Justice Australia, we're still relatively new, but we join a thriving chorus of professions all around the country that really wants a better future for our children and future generations. So like us on our socials, and we will be getting in touch with people who said they wanted to stay connected with us as we move into hopefully a year where we can all get involved in various volunteer activities. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.